Okay, welcome. So I'm not sure what we're doing today, right? We're just going to play a little bit. So we've titled the conversation Discontinuous, How the Mind Imposes Meaning Upon Fragments. I thought that might be fitting given the fragmentary nature of the works, but also when we had a pre-talk, which, is always good to do before the actual talk, I got the sense that, things come to you as they come to you, and you capture them as you capture them, and they kind of go out, of existence. So, I thought maybe for the purposes of engaging with the audience, we could attempt that. And I'll do that mostly in the second half of the conversation. But first, this is an opportunity for me to kind of engage others in philosophy. So we're going to just jump right in and do some philosophy. I see a lot of very faces like this, but it's only, maybe one page, maybe two. So are you all familiar with Immanuel Kant? If you're not, that's fine. Yeah? Okay. So we continue to explore affect in this in conversation series, and by affect we mean something like the changes in ourselves that are prompted by stimuli in which the power of action is increased or decreased. And when contemplating art, the distinction between the sublime and the beautiful is worth considering. So in his third critique, the critique of judgment, also known as the critique of the power of judgment, Immanuel Kant defines beauty in this way. So the beautiful is that which is represented as the object of a universal satisfaction. I'm going to repeat it. The beautiful is that which is represented as the object of a universal satisfaction. So a satisfaction quite disinterested, which implies in one's judgment a ground of satisfaction for everyone. So what he's suggesting is that if I find something beautiful and I'm doing it right, that we would all find it beautiful, which sounds I don't know if I agree, but that's where Kant is at. So since beauty does not rest on any inclination of the person, nor upon any other premeditated interest, but since the person who judges it feels quite free as regards the satisfaction which he or she attaches to the object, the satisfaction is not grounded in any private conditions. Therefore, beauty must be regarded as what can be presupposed by every person. So, for the translation, in a nutshell, Kant is saying beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Kant suggests that if you think your partner is beautiful, for example, because he or she does or has something that you personally find appealing, it may be the case that your partner is not beautiful at all. They may simply be pleasant. And likewise, if in these works of art here today, something inspires a memory of positive affect and you think this piece is beautiful, perhaps it may not be beautiful at all, but merely pleasant to you. For something to be beautiful, according to Kant, we would all have to find it beautiful, evaluated from a place of complete affective detachment. I'm personally not sure whether that is even possible, but there you have it. So, disclaimer, philosophers have a way of being rather annoying. They take terms like beautiful, turn them upside down, crush them, recompose them, and then throw them back at you, often disturbing you in the process. We're kind of doing that a little bit. So thankfully, our artist in conversation today, Jonathan Kopinski, is not particularly concerned with beauty of the regular kind or even of the Kantian kind. Jonathan, welcome. So when we spoke in preparation for this talk, you said to me you're not interested in painting yourself in a particular style or painting yourself into a corner. You want to remain open, narrowing in and expanding out. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you would describe your method? And I put it in quote marks because you may or may not have, or consider that you have a method.
I think the kind of, I suppose, the stylistic pluralism in the work, that's how I maybe define it sometimes, comes about from thinking about how I grew up consuming art.
Yeah.
And so how I grew up consuming art was not, wasn't going to galleries like this where you see one particular solo show or anything like that. It's essentially, it's something where I'd go to the council library and get a book out on 20th century art as a high school student or something and flick through it and like everything and appreciate kind of what I saw. And so I think growing up in that always consuming art as a kind of an art history and in many ways liking everything, I think that's maybe guided the way I approach painting, especially in this show. I think the previous shows have been gradually building up where I want to test everything as much as possible. And so when I look at the work, I can see streams of Renaissance art in it, some medieval art. I can see abstraction in the work. I can see digital kind of post-internet aesthetics that come to play. So really, I've always been someone who likes variation. When I go to, so for instance, the Queensland Art Gallery, I'm always into the Australian galleries where you can just walk through that variation. And so growing up like that, it's kind of, I think it's that way of looking and understanding art as not just as one particular thing that you pursue ad nauseum. I want it to kind of to be open and to excite me and to because that's what I find fun with making art. That's why I enjoy it. And for me, it's there's so much visual stimuli that we take in on a day-to-day basis, and if you kind of look at it, if you really focus on what you're looking at, you can see all these different things that you might appreciate from just terrible ads on Instagram or something, or something a bit more refined, but all of that stuff is visual content. In many ways, I think now it kind of flattens the way that we consume media, and so I enjoy that, and I want to kind of bring that out in the work itself in some ways. And so
okay, and I think you said it earlier when you described it as pluralistic. Yeah. So beauty, forget Kant for a minute, just beauty as we might just think of it or understand it. Do you think that has a role to play in art, and more specifically in your art?
I don't know. I don't ever really think about it in terms of beauty, I suppose. I've never explicitly thought about, is this painting beautiful? I think a lot of it. There are obviously aesthetic decisions that are made in the work, but I don't really know what's driving those aesthetic decisions. It's not many of the decisions are kind of quite mysterious, and I don't put a lot of weight thinking about every decision that's made. It's a kind of it just happens, and then there might be a work, for instance, these the two larger ones of the show, those ones, there's kind of no rhyme or reason as to why I get to this point where I feel like they work for some reason. It kind of accidentally happens, and accidentally I feel like it's enough, and I don't know whether they're beautiful or not. It's not something that I think about really.
It's not an aspiration.
Yeah.
I like this notion of decision though, right? You say aesthetic decision, but it's not thought. What does a decision look like? What does it feel like? How do you know it's a decision when you're making it, right?
Again, I don't know. I really don't know, and that's the beauty of it. Like that's the enjoyable. Well, if there is such thing as beauty, it's about not knowing that this is the right thing or that's the decision. Like so the kind of the rationality kind of just not so concerned about it. And maybe if I sat with each one and thought about, okay, well, is there a kind of a rule of thirds about the composition? Is that make this particular work pleasing, or is it something about an image that's kind of slightly off center? Maybe there's some formalistic rules, but again, I don't think about that. I don't give it any important weight. It's this kind of, again, this natural, mysterious process that I'm kind of comfortable with, and so the works just are what they are. And I guess sometimes a work might irritate me.
It's good
for some reason, and often I think with many of these works, I look at the wall. There's often when you're making the work, and aesthetically speaking, sometimes I think there's this degree of chance that needs to be thrown into the formal decisions about the compositions, and often I find with the chance you need to kind of get to this point where you take a risk of destroying the image or totally stuffing up, and I think the images that I think are, for some mysterious reason, the strongest one that kind of stay with me for, they become favourites for some reason. That, often there's that degree of chance and destruction, almost ruining it, that for some reason that's something that activates it in some way. But again, I suppose, like, in terms of, like, thinking of, like, effect, and I guess it's not an emotional thing. It's this kind of, it's like, when you think of an affect, it's maybe a precursor to emotion, so which you can't really say what it is that's creating that reaction, but it's that mysterious ingredient that what it is, I don't know.
Well, and that's fantastic. I think that ties in really nicely to this contrasting concept of the sublime. And, Kant has this to say about the sublime. So natural beauty, which is independent, brings with it a purposiveness in its form, by which the object seems to be pre-adapted to our judgment. On the other hand, that which excites in us without any reasoning about it, kind of as you say, like without rationale, this feeling of the sublime, which may even appear to violate purpose in respect to judgment, and does violence to the imagination, may be considered even more sublime. Interestingly, Kant, who kind of really valued rationality, is quite disparaging of the concept of the sublime, even though he defines it, and goes on to say we see that the concept of the sublime is not nearly so important or rich in consequences as the concept of the beautiful. The sublime displays nothing purposive, but only in that possible use of our intuitions by which there is produced in us a feeling of purposiveness. So in summary, beautiful implies emotional detachment from the object, emotional disinterestedness, purposiveness, a meaningful object that seems almost pre-adapted to our considerations. On that view, like, one may well consider a spoon as something beautiful. I have no emotional response to a spoon. It's purposive. I know what it's for, and we probably all agree what it's for, which is why I find this notion of the beautiful in Kant kind of a little bit absurd. But by contrast, the sublime implies emotional charge or affective charge when confronted with the object, affective disturbance, no sense of purpose in the object, a frantic search within ourselves to regain some kind of stability and to capture meaning. So in this regard, I find your work rather sublime. And just in case it's not clear, that's a compliment. So, you know, in our pre-conversation, you mentioned you're not interested in didactic art, that you find it tedious. Didactic would imply imbued with pre-given meaning. Could you say a bit more about that?
I appreciate didactic art.
Okay.
So, but I just can't do it. Like, I can't. Something about it, when I try to, you know, think specifically about the didactics behind, you know, the meaning behind a work, I just I can find it to be a little insincere when I'm trying to work it through that way. And so, and again, I think there's this thing about mystery and that I really appreciate in art, and it's something that I wanted to pursue in my own works. And so what I mean by that is when I was a kid going to Quag, for instance, and looking at works, you don't sit there reading the wall text about, you know, what this is. I mean, that was the 90s, so, you know, the wall text for kids didn't exist back then, and so it was this experience of, like, not understanding the works. And again, I like with art history books, I hardly ever read the text either. I just look at the images, and because I think once you read the text, something is lost forever in that artwork, or that initial experience, and the mystery kind of gets drained from it. And I think a lot of contemporary works are often, you know, really pushing a kind of a, you know, there's a didactic, you know, the wall text is almost as important as the work in itself, and everything kind of loops back to and is perfectly resolved at the end. And I guess the works that I've always been attracted to are mysterious, and they cannot be resolved in a didactic sense.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting for me as the artist, because I produce these works, and to a degree I have some idea of maybe some of the rationale to what's behind that, but there's this degree where I myself will never know, and they will always evolve. So look at some of these works that, you know, the meanings of the works have changed considerably since they were produced, and I think to all the kind of the paintings that I love in history, like one of my favorite paintings is Renaissance painting called The Tempest by Giorgione, and that painting, no one knows. Like, numerous books have been written about that painting, and no one knows what the meaning is behind it. Piero della Francesca's The Flagellation as well, another very famous Renaissance work. The three figures that are in the foreground, no one knows who they are. It's such a strange picture, and, you know, centuries still, like, it's that special ingredient. And So like knowing those are those kind of key works for me. Like I'm trying to kind of, again, just always imbue that mysterious factor in it, that so that the painting never becomes dead. I suppose it always has this potential to kind of to evolve and to change with time.
I picked up on your description there of, you know, insincere or insincerity. I quite like that. So is it implied that the didactic is a kind of fabrication after the fact to try to tie in the picture and make it make sense, which is kind of, you know, like what I've titled the talk is our minds trying to impose sense, impose meaning upon something that, which is, you know, potentially unable to be captured that way. But yeah,
I think like, you know, it's like, let's just call it conceptual art, for instance. I think there's you know, really great conceptual art, and I have friends who are, you know, they explicitly have this, you know, rich, deep thinking behind all of the work and every aspect of the work, and I really appreciate that. But I think there's also bad conceptual work.
okay.
You know, it's that kind of the work that you're forced to do in high school, and which I always, you know, I never kind of enjoyed that, and so I myself, I think if I try and wrap up all the loose ends in a work, it just sometimes it kind of falls flat, and so I guess if anything, it's trying to kind of, well, instead of closing everything, let's try and work a way where the work is much more about an openness of meanings and
Sure.
yeah.
So I want to play a little game with you, if that's all right. We talked about it. So this idea of openness and open-endedness, I'd like to explore some of your works, and for those in the audience, the leaflet might be quite helpful here if you have it handy. I'm going to mention an artwork and then just give you a word, and we can attempt some free association. You just tell me what comes up for you, and maybe I'll respond, maybe I won't. Just trying to sort of do art on the fly. Maybe this conversation being like a piece of art in itself. It doesn't have to make sense. In fact, if it doesn't make sense, I think that would be preferable, because then, you know, we would be grappling at this kind of like, oh, but I need it to make sense. And then maybe we'll watch the video in a year and be like, oh yeah, if I were to put a didactic to that, then this is what it would be. So yeah, shall we have a go?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. So person, vacuum, nervous. You can pass because
I think person, vacuum, nervous. I think maybe collective self-portrait.
Okay. Collective self-portrait, a collection of the parts that make a self, or a collection of individual selves over time.
I don't know.
Past.
I don't know. But the time's an interesting one though, because I think that the pointy bit on that one, or the work that you may be referring to,
Yeah.
is that past? Is that present? Is it future? I think that's an interesting affinity that you may bring up there with the time.
I like that. So kind of point in time, or an arrow of time or something. Yeah. L'homme flottant, cloud formations.
I think floating as a kind of a kind of contemporary non-action.
Okay.
or a contemporary form of non-action.
Yeah, I like that. So passivity, as in non-active but passive, or actively non-active?
Well, that's the mystery behind it. It could be either. It could be either.
Okay.
It could be either.
Well, yeah, but you see what I'm asking, right?
Yeah.
Because like if you go into a sense of deep meditation, you actively do that. Whereas if you're passive and not taking agency, or that's something else. But okay, we'll leave it open. I'm enjoying this game, by the way. Pessimist, hollowness.
Pessimist, hollowness. I think for that one I'd say Halley's Comet in the Bayeux Tapestry.
I can't respond to that. I'm going to move on. That was great. Figures in stream, consciousness.
I think that's figures in the stream and consciousness. Well, I mean, you can. I think that's an interesting one because stream of consciousness, obviously. So the two things can go together. Unconsciously streaming. I think stream, the etymology of stream's an interesting one. So again, it applies something that's all around you, I suppose.
Okay. Do you know the etymology? I'm not familiar.
I wrote it down. I'd have to look it up. Yeah.
What root language is it from?
Oh, I don't know. I got it here. Early 12th century.
Yeah.
Anything issuing from a source and flowing continuously. So a Gulf Stream. Stream of consciousness, which is very recent actually. That's 1930s.
Okay.
Stream of thoughts. With that, I think of that. So there's obviously things like stream of consciousness, but I also think of contemporary culture or social conditions. So someone like Manuel Castell's Space of Flows, or Zygmunt Bauman's Liquid Modernity. So it's kind of liquefaction of everything.
I like it. So for me, what comes up is the potential of consciousness arising out of the stream itself, or perhaps, being dissolved into the stream, and perhaps a continuum between the two.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah, or maybe not. Man in stream, solid.
Man in stream, solid. I think that one, in that particular work, it's another floating image. The solid is floating. So one might think of all the... It's an interesting thing, like a solid floating rather than sinking.
Yeah.
Maybe that comes to mind. Maybe in that particular work, the juxtaposition of solid, it's the figure in that work is kind of caught in between. We don't know if that figure is floating away or about to sink.
What comes up for me in that, and there is, woman in stream as well, but man in stream, solid, is almost this sense of masculinity refusing to be to be permeated in any way. It's like wanting to remain impervious, it's solid, while submerged or immersed. But yeah. Social border, arcades.
Social border. When I think of a social border, I think of kind of maybe a parasocial behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
Arcades is, again, obviously, as we spoke about previously, Walter Benjamin. The arcades being an incredibly, the kind of the height of Parisian bourgeois culture, which then gets, over time, become quite daggy and almost archaic.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's an interesting thing. Like I think parasocial behaviour is, again, I don't know, looking at something like reality TV stars of the 2000s, and maybe there's, again, something akin to the arcades of Paris in the 18th century. Maybe we can find, don't know, the kind of the fragments of today, our current context and issues of society back in those TV shows of 20, 30 years ago now.
Yeah. I looked up Walter Benjamin after that conversation, hence, arcades. What I learned, or what I got the impression of with these arcades in Paris at the sort of turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, was that they were, as you say, these bourgeois spaces, quite fashionable, but the manufacture of the textiles and fashion was happening just like right there behind the arcades. So it's almost like the factories, and then they would just kind of have these shop fronts. And I like the analog to reality TV because it's presented to us as something, genuine or real, and yet just like right there behind it is the manufacture of something. And I like your term of parasocial there as well. So yeah, this is fun. We should just hang out and do this. Woman in stream turbulence.
In stream turbulence. I think women in streams are kind of a ridiculous work if you look at it, and if you really look at it, it's kind of this, I suppose, this abstract expressionist field of something, some kind of stream, and this very strange Renaissance-like, but also pop image ripped out of a Chemist Warehouse catalogue, and so the two things don't quite go together, but somehow they kind of work. But I think for me, like when I produced it, there was a something about it struck me as this a kind of a similar form to the pre-Raphaelite painting of Ophelia from one of Shakespeare's great characters. And there's this, I think there's this, remember there's this kind of great quote about Ophelia and the moment of her kind of demise, and she's kind of incapable of distress. And I think, again, I see all the figures, I think they're kind of collective self-portraits as well. Or so there's something interesting, I suppose, in that revealed itself after the making.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to skip a couple.
Yeah.
But Let's see how I go here. Mein innerergiste den Markleite. Spirit.
Yeah, so that work, again, I see it as another kind of collective self-portrait, and I think there's a bit of Max Weber, the German sociologist, in that work, and the name comes out. So my inner spirit that runs the market. So again, it's a work that I think one can be critical of a kind of a current context, but perhaps we're all kind of got our fingers in the pie of a particular situation that we find ourselves in.
Right. I'm hearing woke culture.
Woke? No, not necessarily woke culture. More a kind of a neoliberal context.
But that's what I guess I mean is the hypocrisy sometimes of critique.
Yeah.
When
right.
we all have our finger in the pie.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
We'll do one last one.
Yeah.
We won't go through them all, but flagellazione, redemption.
Redemption. Not too sure about redemption in that one. Again, I think that one there, again, that's obviously a reference. That one in my mind is a reference to the Piero della Francesca's work, and I guess it's the figures have been rearranged slightly, and again, I think it's an interesting one. I'm not quite sure what's happening in the work in my mind. Is it a kind of a self-flagellation in the work, or is it watching it unfold as a viewer? We don't quite know who the characters are. So there's a kind of I suppose it's unclear about who is it, where the characters are. So, and so I think anyone looking at it can maybe almost bring their own kind of thoughts about where they stand as the viewer, or are they a participant in that? Not sure.
Yeah, and I associate it with the word redemption, not because I necessarily see redemption, figured in the work, but it's a question of, so the piece translate flagellation, self-flagellation maybe. Is redemption possible, or are we just kidding ourselves as we self-flagellate?
Redemption is
Don't know.
I don't know. I don't know either. I think it's again, it's up to. It's a question for anyone to maybe look and view the work. It's their own personal question, I think. Not sure.
I like it.
Not sure.
All right. Look, I think we're done.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for everyone. Thank you, everyone, for playing along, potentially, in your minds. So I'd like to invite members in attendance now to ask questions or offer any sort of personal reflections that you may have had. Open Q&A. Go for it.
Yeah, I have one. I wanted to find out, for me, what is just jumping out is both desire and the absurd. So I want to understand arts you have anything to say about that?
Desire. What? Give us an
In a
example.
psychoanalytic sense.
Psychoanalytic sense. Mm.
Because you spoke a lot about, you talk about interpretation and judgment, you talk about the unknown, you talk about an object, you talk about self-portraiture. It just is screaming out to me. So I was wondering, and you talk about didactics and the role that they play and don't play, and at the same time you don't want to incite that or indicate that for the viewer, so you're opening that to their interpretation. So desire is the key, and you talk about how you want to, like, as a viewer, you want to make sense of the situation, or you want to make sense of imagery, and the fragment is a big key there.
Yeah.
So does it play any role for you? And there's a lot of women in the centres, and a lot of your works as well collaged in.
Yeah.
It's an extra thing, but I know it's separate. There's a few degrees of desire at play, but that's an extra one in everything.
Yeah. I mean, some of the, like these ones here, they come from AI chatbots. So again, it's just with the figures in these ones, it's kind of just looking at I suppose images that are kind of, you know, pervasive, I suppose, in kind of current media, and so like those ones in particular, that's I was kind of interested in, like looking at. I was thinking a lot about AI with, like, when I was looking at some of those ones, and so that's how those ones came out. Some of the other ones, I think the other ones are more from. Again, there's some accidental kind of catalogues or random fragments of bits and pieces that I find, and they somehow just find their way on into the work somehow without any kind of rhyme or reason, or you kind of they kind of end up in your collection as fragments of things, of images that somehow work. So, I mean, one of those works down there, the kind of the children's little book, the image from the children's book of like a German, probably 1950s and 60s. It just, there are these things that kind of stand out for some reason, and again, just find their way into the work somehow. And again, there's no intentional, there's no real intentional, like, commentary or that I'm trying to get at, like you say, but maybe there is some kind of, I don't know, underlying psychoanalytical thing. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, wouldn't mind jumping in. Desire, fascinating concept, right? So if we take Lacan, for example, and related to lack, so something missing, one, you know, is a necessary condition for desire, because do we desire what we already have? Potentially not. Do we desire what we lack? But then to connect it with the absurd, and I'm not sure if this is the absurd like from Camus, and, you know, Sisyphus kind of continually pushing his boulder up the hill. And are you sort of bringing these two concepts together to inquire about the absurdity of desire?
No, they were two separate questions. So desire is something very much with Lacan, who I was picking up in this conversation. And then absurd in the sense of like the non-logical.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the absurds kind of comes from a lot of Walter Benjamin. Like, I mean, Walter Benjamin's the only kind of borderline philosopher that I've ever looked into, really. And he's not even really a philosopher. I consider him more of a cultural theorist, but I guess the absurd comes from you know, most of his works are kind of fragmentary, and it's just like a kind of a play on the absurd experience of day to day. Like, I mean, when you're scrolling on your phone, if you think about the amount of absurdity that is just streaming past us constantly, I mean, it's kind of everywhere, and I think it's the most. It is the condition of our time. It's not, and you know, you might say, oh, it's a postmodernist thing, but I think it's always been there since, like, in the Arcades project from the 19th century onwards, and so it's just a kind of a media thing. And I think, you know, all these things are happening in the world, and so in many ways it's trying. I think the work is just it's you know, to a degree it's a reflection, but they're also trying to somehow convey the atmosphere of the contemporary. And so, like, these works here, which are called Unsere Stimmung, which is a German phrase for it doesn't really have a translation in English. It's kind of mood / atmosphere. It's a bit between the two things, and so I think that's what I want to try and convey with the work. And so, so the works are byproducts of that contemporary condition somehow, and so it's somehow a reflection of that, I think. And so going back to I think the desire as well, like I think again I could see that again being a kind of, again, a reflection of a kind of a contemporary situation, maybe, perhaps. I don't know.
Anyone else? Yes.
No, I'm just wondering, looking at the work here, do you feel like have you expanded the media you're working within, and just wondering if you could talk about preferred media? It seems like you're working with a prepared board or
Yeah. So, well, I guess, like, this is where the rationality comes really into play, and I've spoken about this previously. Like, again, it's just, you know, trying to find time to work as an artist is like near impossible, and just to kind of like to, because, you know, you don't make money from art. It's impossible. That's the economic reality of it. So, and you know, if you're an artist who's trying to do it, you're probably not going to succeed. So it is something that you're not doing. So trying just to fit this all in with kind of a day-to-day experience. It's the fragmentation of the form. So Andrew, you'll see, like, these are the canvas boards. I can produce these very quickly, like each one. I can produce them in a fragmented way, because they you know. For these ones, yeah. I mean, most of it's oil painting with a bit of acrylic ground, just because it's cheaper that way. But again, it's a storage thing as well. So I don't have a studio. You know, so these all have to fit into IKEA bookshelves, and they all come together. So it's also the fragmentary of day-to-day life of just, you know, not being able to afford the luxurious amount of time one might want to give to their art. It's a way of, again, dealing with the kind of reality of precarious work. You know, precarious being an artist. So, so the drawings as well, or the drawing prints, they're also another kind of a new thing of, like, you know, having no time, doing them at the end of the day. They're kind of a series of layers that eventually build up. So the fragmentary nature of, you know, living today, day to day, comes into play into the work as well. So I'm always interested in that question about the form of the work, Andrew, because I think it's super important with my stuff and how it comes about. And
seems to be an argument for poetics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think again, like Walter Benjamin and One Way Street, that publication he did. I think it's kind of midway through his career, which is literally just there's kind of it's a book that's just this fragmentary series of aphorisms or little descriptors. It's so different, and again, that's something that he didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write this book. He probably did that at the end of each day over a long period of time after kind of dead end jobs or doing that stuff, and that work is a product of the atmosphere that he was living in, and the poetics come about from that situation, Carl. So yeah, agree.
I feel like I'm moved to look for the fragments of the sublime in the drudgery of my everyday life. I'm gonna go and do that after this.
Yeah. Well, maybe I think sometimes there's a lot of potential in being aware in all those things, and
Jeff,
yeah.
Can you comment on how this what we've just been talking about fits into your thinking about landscape architecture and architecture?
It doesn't fit in very much at all, Jeff. I keep it all very separate. Like,
you do landscape architecture
like this as fragmentary. It's totally different, because I think it's with any of that kind of architecture, the form of the work is getting driven by the force of the project, whether that's economics, and so I think that maybe that's the only similarity, like what's driving the form of the works. But I think like but I still keep it very separate intentionally. So
I mean, is there something inherently inconsistent between architecture and what you're talking about with these artworks? That, when you're talking about frame, well, I'm not adequately representing what you do here, but when you're talking about fragmentation and almost the sort of
well, I think the biggest crossover in terms of architecture would be this Piranesi, who was a Doug or Andrew, 18th century, I think, 18th century, an engraver, etcher. He's known for his etchings of making spaces of jails and these kind of otherworldly heterotopian kind of spaces, and the spaces could never exist because there's all these kind of three-dimensional inconsistencies of it. But really the whole idea of his kind of work is it's all fragmentary in nature. It doesn't make sense, and it's all onto the viewer to kind of try to kind of compose some kind of meaning or logic or something behind the work. But whatever it is, you're never going to get to it. And so Piranesi as a kind of this unique architect working, who's unlike any other architect, I think, in their respective history. I've always, he's probably the only architect I've ever thought about my work in relation to as an influence, maybe guiding the work as a kind of a crossover. He's a fascinating kind of person, and I think again these two bigger ones, I can definitely see there are crossovers. Like they're the most Piranesian of the works in my mind, where that influence is coming to the fore. Maybe the drawings as well.
well, thank you for joining us. And in an attempt to reverse the precarious life of the artist, I invite each of you to purchase some of the art on the wall. That would be good. Yeah, let's wrap up. Have a drink. I think Jeff's bought some wines for us. So, yeah, thank you again.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.